And the first person to speak is my very old friend, Iain Boal. And you can see the title of his talk right there. Iain and I met 35 years ago or more on a hot tennis court in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right by the Harvard Business School, which was an appropriately ironic place for us to be meeting. We were introduced by the future chief art critic of the New York Times, although he wasn't that then. He was a graduate student, as were both of us. And after the game, Iain said, well, there's a small gathering. We've been gathering for a while now. There's a small gathering. We meet every Tuesday or Thursday night. I can't remember which. Perhaps you'll come along. We're talking about anarchism. For years afterwards, that was an immovable feast in my calendar, was to go to Iain's house and sometimes to stay. We all came by bicycle. Stay until whenever the conversation was over, which was often not until 2 or 3 in the morning. Iain is a social historian of technics. He has a book forthcoming on a social history of the bicycle, The Green Machine. He had a Guggenheim grant to write that. He is a founder of Retort. The group we were with in Cambridge was a predecessor to that, called The Pumping Station, and a co-author of Afflicted Powers, the important book that many of you will have read, taken from Milton appropriately, and Paradise Lost, Afflicted Powers, that is, and somebody who has more energy than anybody I've ever met for bringing people together. So it's a pleasure to bring him here and introduce them to some of the people that are here. Iain, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Where are you? There, he's way over here.
Yeah, I figured out. John, thank you for the kind introduction. It's one of the pleasures of this year and any other to be here in this company. Thank you, Claudette, and your team. I plan to speak for 23 minutes about although small, subtle quantum effects might have changed that a bit. It's a bit like the Irish acre, which waxes and wanes depending on local conditions. But no, I hope there's time for conversation at that point. I'm sorry that Jean Ray's not here, with whom I collaborated in the superbly produced catalogue. I was lucky enough to be in London for the show there, which was a gem of a show, and a gathering there, and Susan, who's be speaking later, was on a panel. So this is, I'm very happy to be able to follow up on these themes. My own interest in radioactivity goes back very far. This is an early scene after the discovery in the 1890s of the effect of radioactive decay, which, by the way, some of you might not know this, saved Darwin. Darwin was confronted with the fact that in order for his theory to work, he needed deep time. And when he asked the best man of his epoch, namely Kelvin, how long have we got in terms of the age of the Earth? Kelvin said, well, 20, 30, 40 million years max. And Darwin was puzzled because he didn't want to give up his theory for a fact. He said it's way too irresponsible, it's explaining far too much. What Kelvin, of course, didn't know, and it was about 20 or 30 years later only that it was discovered that it was radioactive decay that was allowing making up for the difference between a cooling body when you run the thing back and try to understand the dynamics of a cooling Earth. So this is an early scene in the exploitation of radioactivity. I'm the son of an Irish radiologist, and my father's house was full of apparatus that looked not unlike this. By a kind of irony, too, my mother died of a cancer that I'm sure was induced by the implanting of a cobalt source of radioactivity, which was supposedly better than a hysterectomy. Later on, I became active in the 70s in the anti-nuclear movement of the late 70s and worked with Edward Thompson, the social historian, and the European nuclear disarmament movement. We were reacting to the two things. One was to the decision by Anthony Benn as Minister of Energy to promulgate the Nuclear Constables Act of the mid-70s on the grounds that nuclear techniques was so dangerous that it required draconian laws, more draconian than anything since 1381 and the Peasants' Revolt, because of the dangers. And of course, then with the decision to implant cruise missiles in Europe, that's what galvanized a lot of us. Then when I moved to Boston to play tennis with John in the early 80s, of course, that in a sense that was part of the the second draft of the Cold War, in the bright springtime of Reagan's senility, and massive gatherings in Central Park, as you remember. I became later a historian of one corner of the Manhattan Project. Went into the archives, into Enrico Fermi's archives. Henry Farmer, that was his secret code name, Enrico Fermi, Henry Farmer. That will have really challenged them. The experiment in Chicago, the proof of concept. This is actually an impossible perspective from a war artist. In the semi-subterranean rackets court beneath the west stand of Stagg Field in Chicago, where Fermi, Compton and Fermi staged the first sustained chain reaction. The balcony up on the top left is where Fermi and about 30-odd others were standing. And down there below, and this is important because I'm going to make some remarks about these, the geography of sacrifice that constitutes the nuclear planet. There's something about these spaces, the spaces of medicine, of medical experimentation, I shall talk about in a moment, these scientific spaces, which and it also happened certainly at Ground Zero, so-called Ground Zero in Manhattan, when very senior officers of OSHA, people who'd spent their lives telling others to wear masks, did not do so themselves, even though they knew it was an extraordinarily toxic scene. What is it about the viriculture of this scene here, which meant that we don't know how many of them, but many of them did die early of radiation poisoning. But down there, in the foreground, there's a technician wearing a coat, that should help, who's pushing in and out a 2x4, nailed to which is a cadmium strip, which is to moderate the reaction. This is on December the 2nd, 1942. And 25 years to the minute after criticality, this object is unveiled. This is Atom Piece, renamed by the Chicago authorities, nuclear energy. This is Henry Moore's Atom Piece, a medium-sized version, maquette of which is, of course, here in Toronto. I became also interested in John mentioned afflicted powers. In terms of spectacle, I think we shall be spending some of today and tomorrow thinking about, of course, the conditions of spectacle under which we live now, and the importance of the atomic sublime and the domestication as well of the atomic iconography, this is a very recognizable condensation, it seems to me, of the skull and the mushroom cloud. Henry Moore refused to say much about this object, but it scandalized the scientists of Chicago, who thought that it was a savage critique of their project. Although, interestingly, when a smaller, he made an edition of 6, a smaller version of this was bought by the municipality in Hiroshima, it was moved rather quickly on the grounds that it was a celebration of the bomb, which just goes to show that no humanist artwork can, of course, transcend its conditions, its sighting. This is what's left and marks the world's first nuclear waste site out at the Palos Reserve out near O'Hare. The moderating graphite was buried there after Chicago pile number 1 was dismantled. Again, it's an interesting question. Some of you, of course, are quite familiar with the project of trying to mark toxic waste and the problems of how on earth you make something a danger, a warning signal legible 10,000 years, an arbitrary low figure, into the future. My own work on nuclearism is seen in the light of a larger interest of mine in the Luddites, in Luddism. The Luddites have had a terrible press, both from the left and the right, who've told the same lie about the weavers of the late 18th century and early 19th century, who smashed the looms that were immiserating their children and putting them into what we now call factories, the incarceration of production. The idea that somehow they were against technology, whatever that could possibly mean. How come, therefore, that if the Luddites often would be breaking old looms and leaving new ones intact? It all depended on the social relations production, what they were being used for. And I'll end up, I think, with some with a few remarks about the politics of technology and how we might think about the nuclear world. I should just say I've been consistently inspired by a great foundational essay by Lewis Mumford, who wrote it in a house kitty corner from my own rambling household in Berkeley at the corner of Arch and Rose. And Lewis Mumford wrote a great essay, Authoritarian versus Democratic Technics, which I still think is germane to our discussions here. What convivial technologies might be. What I'm just going to do now in these few minutes is to tell very briefly the story of Alice Stewart, and which I think will illuminate the themes of our gathering here for these 2 days, set certain key terms in resonating, and actually introduce a couple of new ones which might, I hope, be helpful. Alice Stewart was an English physician, the daughter of two physicians, born in 1906 in Sheffield. She was a high-flying young medical student, very, very few of them women in those days, treated with grotesque sexist condescension by her male colleagues, which gave her a fierce determination, which she certainly needed throughout her life, because what happened to Alice Stewart was, in a sense, an epitome of a life of a woman in science and medicine, particularly somebody who found results that was uncongenial to power. I met her only a couple of times. She used to, several times she visited the Bay Area and stayed with Joyce Lashoff, who was Dean of the School of Public Health. she became the kind of medical scientific voice of the anti-nuclear movement because of her work in the 50s. I was in the cool HVAC protected, conditioned room in the Wellcome collection in London a couple of years ago. The conservation department there is run by my own compañera, and I was in the room where the film stock is kept, and I smelt that interesting and alarming smell of vinegar, of acetic acid, of degrading film stock. And I looked at the reels, and it turned out to be an interview with Alice Stewart, and that was a name that I hadn't thought of for a long time. What I'm now embarked on is a documentary about Alice Stewart with a distinguished filmmaker in London, Catherine Bate. And Alice Stewart's archive is in the Wellcome collection. And I'm just going to tell you very briefly what happened. That in the mid-50s, having been a young socialist physician in the 30s, in the war work, she got opportunities that would not have been afforded a woman. She went to work in industrial medicine, along with one of her colleagues, Richard Doll, Red Richard, as he was called, D-O-L-L, later knighted, Sir Richard. Red Richard became Sir Richard. They were both young physicians in social medicine, as it was called then, that sort of epidemiology avant la lettre. As socialists, they were interested, of course, in public health in a way that stood very much against the individualized encounter in Harley Street between the grand physician, pinstripe physician, and the client and the customer. She found herself working in the early mid-50s on an interesting problem, which was that there was a spike of leukemias in the richer, in the wealthier postcodes across the British Isles. And she devised a very interesting questionnaire, and the results of which are still the most important longitudinal study of childhood cancers anywhere, even though eventually, I can just say very quickly, that all her funds were cut off. What she discovered is in these manila folders here, tens of thousands of them eventually, bringing in data from every single medical officer of health throughout the land. She devised a brilliant questionnaire that her male colleague said was not the way to do epidemiological studies, because she was asking the mothers for their own opinions, their memories of the children who had died of leukemia between the years of 1953 and 55. When the results came back, she was completely agnostic about the cause of all this. It could have been in the food, the new white goods. She was not looking for what she found. It jumped out at her. After about 35 of the envelopes were opened, it jumped out at her. It was a remarkable result, namely that these leukemias were caused by single low-dose shots of radiation for fetal xrays. Now, the exploitation of the phenomenon of radioactivity, of course, is used medically pretty early on, and here's Curie, one of these portable ambulances used in the First World War. What begins to happen, and Alice Stewart calls it sort of ironically or sardonically kind of toys for the boys, is that X-rays, pelvic and abdominal X-rays, are delivered to pregnant women. So fetal X-rays turned out to be a real risk. This result flew in the face of the work that established a safe threshold. This is the work that came out of an enormous amount of work that came out of the atomic bomb casualty commission, the ABCC, post-Hiroshima, and the standard orthodox line that there was a threshold below which there were no effects. And later, Alice Stewart found herself having to investigate this, because it's still the case that so-called safe doses of ionizing radiation are based on the work done in the years after Hiroshima, in ways that Alice Stewart has, she died in 2002 or 3, that Alice Stewart began to challenge when she realized that work was fundamentally flawed. When she published her results in the Lancet and BMJ, there was a virulent reaction, shall we say, from the medical establishment, from the burgeoning nuclear industry, power industry, and of course from the atomic states. This was not welcome news. This was a messenger they did not want to listen to. And what they did was they set one of her colleagues, a fellow socialist, Red Richard, whom I've mentioned, Red Richard, now at this late stage of his life. This is a photograph of him receiving, I forget which prize this is, but very late on. This is perhaps in 2004, the year before he died, in his 90s. By then, the most feted and lauded epidemiologist in the world, famous for elucidating the relation between tobacco and cancer. It wasn't really he that did it, but he was there to do a very large study that did establish that relation. In the mid-50s, they identified Richard Doll as somebody who would perhaps could be used to take down Alice Stewart. And indeed, that's what he did. He published what he later realized or admitted was shoddy work, but nevertheless it was too late to undo its effects. And I asked my father as a radiologist after he retired, but before he died, what he had done when he heard the news of Alice Stewart's argument that there should be no fetal x-rays, that this kind of photography was potentially and in fact really lethal. And my father said, well, he had paused, but then when Richard Doll published his paper in 1960, he started up again. And it was only another decade and a half later, of course, that finally non-emergency fetal x-rays were stopped. They've been mostly, of course, replaced by ultrasonography, which certainly has its own thermal dangers, but is obviously not as dangerous. Not obviously, but I think it is not as dangerous. I think that's true. But there again, we could talk about the physics, the war, and the civilianization of these techniques. As you know, the swiveling of anti-submarine submarine detection devices onto the fetus has had a tremendous response in the civilian population. Mothers and grandmothers and relatives love to see these sonograms, which are not medically necessarily indicated at all. And then, of course, this is just a little digression. You'll remember the Pettis Cope. Who here went under a Pettis Cope? Who have we got? Ah, the Injuriat. Yes, the class of those wounded by technics. How are your feet, sir? Yes, so that's a Pettis Cope. And this is, again, a bit like the atomic postcards. This is the kind of the domestication of radioactivity. Of course, it's the metrology of this, dosimetry, is a very important question. And there's an ongoing and interesting history of imaging phantoms that began with the, actually back in the Manhattan Project, and is a very interesting corner of medical and nuclear history. Here's a cranial and a head phantoms. Here's a whole body phantom, and these are used as these fetuses are used for training purposes for in ultrasound. The lethal photography that is X-radiology is interesting also because of the dose question. Now, dose is the gift of the physician to the patient. Dosis in Greek is the same word as donation. A dose is a gift. What's interesting about radiology, of course, that it's also the self-gift. Because of backscatter and other things, and possibly putting your hand and other parts of your body directly in line, radiologists, the röntgenologists in the early days, were part of the Injuriat, the class of those wounded by technics. Alice Stewart was motivated, as was Red Richard, by, of course, shall we say, the industrial Injuriat, going back to the great works of public health in the 19th century. Fred Engels in Manchester, of course, his great work combing through the sanitary movement reports of the 19th century, the early mid-19th century. It was Engels who said, well, clearly these deaths are perfectly predictable. That's interesting. But we can't say exactly who and what. It's not like Professor Plum with the lead piping, right, in the conservatory. No, these are often, particularly those stochastic effects, those that aren't deterministic. Obviously, a very large blast of rads and prompt radiation in Hiroshima is going to kill you. But the latency period and the uncertainties make for interesting problems in epidemiology and in medicine in general, particularly over questions of compensation. And Red Richard, later Sir Richard, was vital for the industries that wished to deny their workers compensation. And he was very adept at making cost-benefit calculations. And maybe I should just say at this point that I think it's really interesting that it was a communist, he was in the party, that it's a communist who's able to, who has no problems, as it were, thinking like a state. Big data are very, very important in understanding the etiology of cancers. You can't do without it, and indeed I would say in general that's true for medical, for diseases of all kinds. Richard Doll had no problem, I think we can say this, understanding that sacrifices had to be made if industry was to proceed. And he was able to make satisfying statements over Agent Orange, over dioxin, over asbestos, and so on. That was not true for Alice. So this, I'm going to close here with just a few remarks about the politics of technology and scale and scope. It seems to me that we're up against sort of the limits of photography and what photography can tell us here as historical documents. These, if anything, these snapshots of these interesting instruments tend to disguise or make it harder to see that What we're really talking about is a set of social relations. If we ask about, say, the old order Amish, and what was it that they didn't like about electricity? Well, the Amish do not ban electricity completely. They don't fetishize the juice itself. They just don't like being on the English, as they say, on the English grid. Okay, they'll use their own generators. So, again, it's a bit like the Luddite question. It's to do with the social relations. And I would say that nuclear techniques are, in a way, the perfection of thinking like a state. It's only on that scale that you can get these kinds of technologies. It's hard to say what an alternative. I'm not suggesting we just want to live in a kind of Black and Decker world in which the largest thing that the human prosthesis is a you drop it on your foot and it won't hurt too much. But I think we can safely say that every social order secretes a spatial order, and these power stations are an epitome of that. The dangers of radiation, ionizing radiation, are still not acknowledged. The fact is that it's still these Hiroshima studies, even long after, a decade more after Alice Stewart's death, are still the baseline on which safety standards are set. She, I think, satisfactorily exploded that work by showing that all that data was based on healthy survivor effect. Now, the healthy survivor effect was very similar to the healthy worker effect. In other words, the population on which these studies of latent cancers are produced, actually, these populations are not representative because of the tremendous insults to the immune system that ionizing radiation produces. So, I was going to finish by saying that one of the problems of working in this field is that, of course, there's still an enormous amount of secrecy. And I'll just finish with an anecdote that in the late 80s I was working with Robert Proctor down at Stanford, and we were working on the questions of tobacco, in which Richard Doll figures largely in that story. And that was the moment at which a secret memo was leaked from Brown and Williamson, one of the big six, from the tobacco industry laboratories. And we were still enough children of the Enlightenment to believe that although science might, for the most part, produce, as it were, false knowledge, and that most everything we think we know eventually turns out not to be so, nevertheless, it came as a shock to read a sentence coming out from Brown and Williamson's secret memo, which said simply, "Doubt is our product." Doubt is our product. Smokescreen, as it were. Maybe it's not so surprising now, because we live in a world of, we know about sort of junk climate science. Gibson's law, for every PhD, there's an equal and opposite PhD. So Robert asked me the question, as speaking to me as a recovering classicist, well, what would we call the science of ignorance, of socially constructed ignorance? Because again, it's the Enlightenment view is that somehow there's an ocean of unknowing or the unknown, and it's just out there, and of course it's limitless and so on. This suggested that under conditions of modernity and its knowledge factories, that actually that this ignorance has contours. Yeah? And what would the study of that be? And I came up with agnotology, and we've now had, we have a book, Agnotology, and it's the science of constructed ignorance. And I would argue, particularly if you read Peter Gallison's terrific essay in there about secrecy and the nuclear state, that we have a lot of things to learn that some people know but we don't. Agnotology as a word, by the way, has recently been banned in the courts of Florida in a tobacco case. That tells you something about the plaintiffs for big tobacco who said that they want it, and the judge went along with it. I don't know the arguments about why that was, except to say that it's partly to do with the power of naming, just to be able to say, you know, that big tobacco, who are legally felons, by the way, I mean, they've been found to be in a conspiracy. It's the largest public health disaster in history. Agnotology seems a necessary science and a topic for our conversations. Hang on, where are we going? Sorry, I thought I had one more slide. So I just finished then with a quote from the catalogue, which I don't have. So it's a paraphrase. Ulrich Beck, in his work on risk, said, democratic techniques, we need to constantly use doubt against dogmatism. The problem we face, of course, is that is now the industry line. Doubt is the responsible thing, according to big tobacco, and those who are against further acknowledgement that there is no safe dose. So the Cartesian doubt is being used against us, and it's extremely dangerous. And that is why I think all we can do is keep dialectically on our toes and look to, in my view, the great pantheon of the nuclear age, namely Alice Stewart, Frank Oppenheimer, and Joseph Rotblat, who was the one radiobiologist who was a friend of my father's, who walked away from Los Alamos. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Yes, right here. Jamie.
Hey, this is for Iain. Oh, hi. Okay. Question about Richard Dahl. Was that the Red Richard? Okay. Oh, curious if you have anything to say about the fact that and he was lauded as a epidemiologist, maybe, I don't know, until his death. You showed that photograph of him getting an award in 2004, and which is curious to me, especially given that you mentioned sounded like he was a little weak on asbestos, dioxane, and another thing you mentioned. So what about this? He's been known to be soft on all these health risks, but then continuing to be lauded until maybe his death or recently. So if you have any comments about the social conditions making that happen?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, good question about Richard Dahl. I think what happened is that he was asked. He was identified, even though he would stand up for a decade or two and say, you know, as a communist, you know, a young physician in the 1930s. By 56, he was identified by the establishment. I can imagine a meeting in the Athenaeum in which, after Alice Stewart's the publication of her results, he's identified as a kind of safe pair of hands. Khrushchev has made his speech. Windscale is cranking up. It's the birth of the first big burst of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Her result is a serious threat to nuclearism. And Dahl, of course, has been working in social medicine, and he I think he's asked to destroy the reputation. He spends the rest of his life slighting Alice Stewart. He becomes the Regius Professor of Medicine in Oxford. He makes sure that she gets no grants. Even her survey, her cancer survey, which she offers to Oxford when he takes over, he refuses it. That photograph, by the way, Bob took that photograph, that great photograph of Alice standing by the by the survey. Dahl, I mean, it's interesting because he's no fool, of course, and he talks about the risk-benefit calculus, and it's only after he's dead that it was exposed that he was taking so much money from industry. So in that sense, it's explained. When I said that it was interesting to me that he was a communist, there's all kinds of ways, of course, and there's the ironies of the bomb, that it was a communist project. You know, so many of them were communists or fellow travelers. Frank Oppenheimer, who I mentioned, you know, for his great work in, you know, his bid for redemption through the Exploratorium. I mean, critical museology is massively in debt to J. Robert Oppenheimer's brother, Frank Oppenheimer. Those of you who've ever been to the Exploratorium in San Francisco know it's absolutely crucial in the history of interactive pedagogy and things everywhere. And Frank's bid for redemption was through a kind of open pedagogy, and precisely to refuse the secrecy and the fact that nobody knew that Dahl was taking all this money from industry. I mean, a lot of it just falls out simply on institutional grounds. You know why he's saying that, because if you knew that he was taking their money. But it was always available to make this cost-benefit calculus. But the question's a great one, and this documentary, I hope, will lay out the struggle between Stewart and Dahl.
Anyone else? Yes, over here. Thank you.
Can you hear me, or do I need this?
We can hear you.
Okay, I'm just going to talk then. My question is for Blake, or it's really a comment. My family is actually from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, so I have a lot of nuclear in my past. But the photographs from the house of, Mudar, and you might know this, but there was a photograph of Donna Reed, which you didn't mention. And Donna Reed pushed for a movie about the Manhattan Project called The Beginning or the End. That was produced by MGM in 1947, along with her science teacher, who had been a chemist at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So it seems that maybe all of those actors or actresses have some kind of nuclear connection.
That's a really interesting, I didn't know that, and thanks for that. And it's a really interesting connection. I began to really suspect that this was really a Madame Curie album. That at first I thought it was just one movie, because there are other movie stars in there, Lucille Ball, just a number of these people that have no connection at all to the Madame Curie movie, or no known connection to radioactive issues per se. But then I did start to see that it was a kind of incestuous group in there, and they were all somehow connected to the film Madame Curie, but now even further than that. So it's interesting because on the one hand, it seems like a fairly innocent little album, but really, in a sense, it could well be his own idiosyncratic album of the nuclear era. And I think that's actually something to look further into for me. So thank you.
Iain has a footnote.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. Just a footnote to that. Madame Curie's notebooks, it turns out, are in the Wellcome Library. You saw the photographs of the Petit Curie, the ambulances, when she was in the First World War. My partner Gillian is in charge, I say, of the conservation department there and has the problem of dealing with the notebooks. It's fascinating in terms of agnotology, the way in which we desperately need a kind of citizen science. It's very unclear the mysteries of uranium that Robert was talking about. It's crucial to understand the difference between internal and external emitters. There's really very little danger from these notebooks, which were on her laptop, her laboratory desktop. The problem is that if you get the friable nature of the cover, when that stuff comes off and you inhale it or ingest it, that's the big problem. We have to, we really do need to understand the nature of the substance that we're talking about. And that's why it's an episode in agnotology. I mean, this is constructed ignorance. It's shameful, and we need to change this.
The coffee's here, so we'll take one last question or comment here and then depart through the center doors.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to especially thank Blake and Robert for that wonderful presentation on Port Hope. And I wanted to just hear a bit more about not the work on Port Hope, but the work documenting mining, uranium mining, and the photographic work of Dene miners that Robert did. And I'd just like to hear more about your thinking about that photographic work, about what we might call like Canada's nuclear colonialism. So I'd love to just hear a little bit more about that work.
Well, I can tell you that it was very difficult to get up to the Key Lake mine. I had to lie. I say I was a radio reporter. And when I got up there, I said, oh, by the way, I brought my camera. Can I take a few shots? Very difficult to get in. They protect their turf very much. But I also went to Uranium City. I thought that would be a very interesting place to go to. And I went to Elliott Lake. As far as a concerted, organized effort to really track this down, I'm not aware of it's happening. It takes not only effort, but it takes a certain amount of funding. It would make a great grant project. I have this group called the Atomic Photographers Guild, and if we could get a grant to cover the impact on native people and uranium, I mean, it's a great subject. I've also been to New Mexico and Arizona photographing, and I know several people who have also done it, but it's not organized. It's like a herd of cats with cameras going around doing what they can. But it should be a consolidated project. That would be great. But nuclear culture is not at that big funding level, as far as I know.
Bob, thank you. Blake, thank you. I don't know whether this is turned on. Iain, thank you.